All right, so when we started this lesson on Monday, for content that is based on chapter 12, information coming out of chapter 12 of your text, I said that eventually you're going to launch into a discussion that is going to have us juxtapose the philosophies of these two leaders. Gentlemen, you probably have at least some passing familiarity with in Booker T. Washington and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. So what I was doing, however, was setting the stage, first of all, for the backdrop against which these two gentlemen's leadership are going to emerge. Their leadership is going to emerge. And you'll pardon me while I suck on this peppermint. I thought it'd be done by now, but I'm not quite done. So I hope I'm not grossing you guys out too badly. We talked about how in the years between 1877 to 1901, there were all of these undercurrents and events and incidences that were taking place in American history that is going to have a seismic impact on the African-American experience, particularly as it relates to, for example, the bullet point there about federal troops being removed from the South, thus bringing about the onset of Reconstruction's conclusion, the so-called reestablishment of home rule, Gilded Age with its renewed focus on economic growth, thus leaving the concerns of the recently emancipated for them to kind of fend for themselves. And then, of course, the outsized influence of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and how the recently concluded Civil War and Reconstruction period was even to be talked about and remembered in the broader consciousness of the country. Of course, we have the rendering of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that set in place the separate but equal doctrine, establishing de jure segregation by law. We also, I think, made the distinction between what is de jure segregation and what was de facto segregation as it relates to sort of these unspoken rules related to racial etiquette, how one was to conduct him or herself if they were a Black person, to sort of reinforce these notions of what one's proper place was if you were Black. And then finally, I defined very informally what the word Nadir means. It means lowest point, and the fact that the early 20th century is often referred to as the Nadir period of race relations. We then saw a brief documentary video, which, if anything else, besides the content of what that video spoke to with regards to the lost cause narrative, hopefully you were paying attention to the actual style of the documentary, because that's kind of what I have in mind for you to reproduce for me with these oral histories that you're conducting. Okay, roughly the same length of time and roughly the same format. So hopefully you all were catching that. And same thing with, okay, so we talked about sharecropping. We took a look at this picture and analyzed it, looked at some relics from the Jim Crow past, and even then launched into a discussion of the convict leasing system. And then we talked about the role that women played in the preservation movement, specifically the role of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And again, with that video, hopefully you have taken a look at the style and the approaches that they took in their production, because that's kind of what I have in mind for you to do with respect to these oral histories. So this is where we're going to actually pick up with today. So what you are looking at now is a picture of one of my personal sheroes. This is Ida B. Wells. Ms. Wells was an investigative journalist. When I speak of her in my mainstream AMH 2020 classes, I put her in the same class of investigative journalists from this era of American history. Collectively, they were known as muckrakers. And they were named muckrakers because they were accused of raking up all the muck or dirty undersides of American society, whether it be in regards to politics or some other aspect of society or American, the business practices of America's largest corporations. These were the journalists that conducted their work and then would publicize the findings of their investigations for the edification of the American people as a way of raising awareness. In Ida B. Wells's case, the issue or the concern that she was most, I should say, the most preoccupied with or the most consumed with was the practice of lynching. Now, you may recall that we said about the early 20th century that this was the lowest point of race relations in American history. This is based on, the observations of the historians who make this claim. I happen to agree with them because this was the point in which politicians are making overt racialized appeals on the basis of white supremacy. Of course, we see, the erection of all of these Confederate statues and other forms of memorabilia. The Jim Crow policies are going on the book, so now it's legally okay to openly discriminate against people based on race. Of course, you've got the implementation of all these racial etiquette, sort of racialized codes of how you're supposed to act. But the other thing, and probably one of the most defining characteristics of this time period, was the prevalence of the extra legal practice known as lynching. Another way of, yes. How about that? I was actually going to reference that. A whole 100 and something odd years later, we finally have a federal anti-lynching law on the book. And you might say, well, Jesus, what took so long? Well, you know how these things go. Mrs. Wells was an anti-lynching crusader who was also a primary leader in the campaign to put federal level anti-lynching legislation on the books. A dream of hers that would not be realized until a week ago, 2022. Okay. There had been various anti-lynching proposals put forth, and going back to my original point, or the point that I was getting in the middle of making, one of the defining characteristics of the Nadir period of race relations in this country was the very prevalence of lynching. Between the years 1890 and 1930, there wasn't a week that went by that at least two, usually African Americans, though not exclusively, but mainly African Americans, were being lynched somewhere in the South. And the thing about these lynchings, besides just the fact that, the mere act of lynching, and usually, let's define what lynching is. It doesn't always have to involve hanging, but that method has become synonymous with the word lynching. Tar and feathering, tarring someone and then, plastering them with feathers, that's another form of lynching. What they used to do to women accused of witchcraft in medieval Europe. Trial by ordeal, that too is a form of lynching, if you're familiar with that term and that process. This is when a woman was accused of, let's say, witchcraft. To prove that she wasn't a witch, if she wanted to prove her innocence against that allegation, she would have to subject herself to being thrown into the middle of a body of water. And if she floats, she's a witch, therefore found guilty and subject to execution. If she doesn't float, then the deduction is, oh, she was in fact immortal. But the problem there is she's drowned. So, it's one of those pick your poison, right? Do I die by execution, or do I literally die by drinking poison? I guess one way is less painful, one way is quicker. I don't know. But trials by ordeals are also forms of lynching. Now, in this country, however, especially within the context of this time period we're speaking of, lynching most always included or involved hanging off of a structure, be it a tree or like a bridge or something like that. And they almost always involved Black men, although occasionally Black women and even children could get lynched too. And usually the basis of this particular act, particularly if it involved a Black man or a Black boy, had to do with some breach of racial etiquette. And usually that breach involved allegations of looking at a white woman or being accused of assaulting one. And again, usually all it took was the mere allegation. So there's no due process. The lynching was carried out sometimes with the complicity of law enforcement, if not the actual involvement, certainly by members of the civilian population of a given locale. What made these incidences particularly harrowing is just the public nature of them. Lynchings became public spectacles attended by the greater community, including children. In fact, children's attendance at lynching was considered one of the tactics and one of the strategies that was employed to reinforce notions of white supremacy in white children. I'm actually reading a book now called Raising Racists. And I just completed a chapter on this time period where children were actually brought either to the lynching itself or were made privy to the aftermath of the lynching, where they would see the dangling corpse of the individual who had just gotten lynched. Usually there was some form of mutilation that was involved, either the burning of the corpse or, I won't say decapitation, although sometimes that happened too, but some, cutting away of body parts to use as souvenirs, all sorts of heinous types of things. Now, this is probably this account here that I'm about to share. This account that I'm sharing here, noted on the screen that I also have a brief video for, is most likely, quite possibly, one of the most disturbed things, disturbed accounts of any lynching. I mean, all of them are pretty disturbed, if you ask me, but this one was just especially heinous. It began when somebody killed Hampton Smith, a white plantation owner. Suspicion fell on Sidney Johnson, an African-American worker said to have had a wage dispute with Smith. A vengeful white mob, unable to find Johnson, killed other Black people instead, including a man named Hayes Turner. His wife, outraged beyond self-preservation, loudly vowed to swear out a warrant against the murderers. So the next day, they came for her. Mary Turner was maybe 20 years old. She was 8 months pregnant. They strung her up by her ankles in a tree. They doused her with gasoline and motor oil. They set her afire. But that wasn't the worst of what they did. Now, the person providing this account was not Miss Wells. It was one of her compatriots, one of her contemporaries, a man named Walter White. Walter White, at the time of this accounting, was an official with the NAACP. And he too was a leading anti-lynching crusader. And one of the things that he did, because of his physical appearance, because in physical appearance, he more closely resembled a white man, he actually went undercover, disguised as a white man to attend these lynchings. Or in the case of the account that he's providing here, conducted interviews with firsthand eyewitnesses who would feel freer or would talk more freely to somebody who they believed was white like they were, so that he could extract the most accurate and detailed accounting of some of these incidences as he could. So the White that's being referred to here is Mr. Walter White. When White goes on to write, and he's getting this from the accounting of somebody who was there or who was an actual participant. Wrote White, mocking ribald laughter from her tormentors answered the helpless woman's screams of pain and terror. Mister, you ought to have heard the nigger wench howl, a member of the mob boasted to me a few days later. The clothes having burned from her crisply toasted body, in which unfortunately life still lingered. Remember, she was pregnant. A man stepped towards the woman and with his knife ripped open the abdomen in a crude cesarean operation, out tumbled the prematurely born child. 2 feeble cries it gave, and received for answer the heel of a stalwart man as life was ground out of the tiny form. This occurred between Quitman and Valdosta, Georgia, over on the Lowndes side of the Brooks-Lowndes County lines in Southwest Georgia. So roughly about an hour and a half north of here. I don't know how many of you are fairly native to this area and maybe know where Valdosta is and where Quitman is, but these are 2 small communities in South Georgia. So this happened between those 2 communities in 1918. In recognition and in acknowledgement of this just heinous incident, if ever there was one, they finally erected a roadside marker on the 100th anniversary of this event back in 2018. Here's a brief video. I'm just let me just make sure here. I need to stop sharing for just a sec, because I don't think I'm set up to share video sound. So let me stop sharing. Make sure I click those boxes. Okay. And bring up the video in here.
This series of videos is being created to remind the world of the 100-year era between when the Civil War ended and the Civil Rights Movement came to pass. Most of these stories are gruesome, despicable, and horrific, but they need to be told in order for certain critics of present-day political agendas to have an accurate representation of what life was like for Blacks after slavery. Too often there's an almost purposeful ignorance, a contempt for those of color, and a stain on the true horrors that African Americans faced daily. A life without justice, a life of oppression, a life without safety. These are their stories. This is the small river between Brooks and Lowndes County in southern Georgia. A small rural stretch of land founded in the year 1858. While the waterway known as Little River seems a peaceful and serene landscape, It was on this very spot that one of the most heinous crimes ever to be committed on American soil took place. This is the spot of the lynching of Mary Turner. In southern Georgia during the early spring of 1918, a white plantation owner by the name of Hampton Smith was found murdered at the age of 25. Immediately drawing an angry crowd, the plantation workers of Hampton's property, also known as Old Joyce Place, were targeted at once. Within the list of 13 suspects was a man named Hayes Turner. Born in 1892, Hazel Hayes Turner was a 19-year-old farm laborer who was married to a young woman named Mary Hattie Graham. Taking her married name of Turner, Mary was 8 months pregnant at the time of Hampton Smith's killing, and the couple knew all too well about the dangers they now faced for simply being black. Within just 3 days of Smith's untimely death, Hayes Turner was one of many who were captured by police and arrested as a suspect. Little did Turner know, but a plantation worker named Sidney Johnson was already being looked at as the main suspect, not Turner. Despite the whimsy of Georgia's judicial system following Smith's murder, Hayes Turner was nonetheless questioned and kept in the county jail for further investigation. That was until the sheriff decided Turner might be more safe from the town's angry mob if he was taken to a neighboring city and held in custody there. County Sheriff Wade, who was accompanied by a court clerk, removed Hayes from his cell and headed towards the town of Quitman. Hayes never made it. At some point, Sheriff Wade stopped the vehicle en route as a mob of 40 white men blocked the road. They snatched the prisoner out of the vehicle, and a handcuffed Turner was led into the woods where he was hung by the neck in a tree. His body stayed there from Saturday to the following Monday, when he was finally cut down and his corpse was buried no more than 50 feet from the tree where he was murdered. Already distraught over the arrest of her husband while she was inching ever closer to her delivery date, Hayes Turner's wife Mary was traumatized the following day when she learned that her husband had been lynched. Without a doubt, Mary knew that the persons responsible hid their acts behind the shine of a sheriff's badge, and in her despair she publicly announced her pleas for justice to be served. She demanded that those responsible for her 19-year-old husband's brutal murder be charged with their crime, and that they proceed to seek justice in the local county courtroom. When the mob heard of Mary's demands, they sprung into action to hunt the pregnant woman down. Mary simply had no time to escape the clutch of their racist grasp around the neck of the situation. When the mob caught up with Mary, just one single day after the lynching of her own husband, the crowd showed no mercy as they put their deranged plan into action. First, the crowd of white mobsters took her to Folsom Bridge. A tree hung just over the water on the banks, and that was where they decided to throw their rope. They tied the pregnant widow's feet together tightly and began to hoist her off the ground feet first. As Mary Turner dangled from the tree upside down, she began to scream in pain and cried for mercy over the life of her unborn child. The mob would have none of it. They then began throwing buckets of liquid on Mary, which were filled with motor oil and petroleum from their vehicles. With a gas-soaked face and her clothing that was dripping with the flammable combination, a match was lit. As Mary's hair caught fire, she screamed in agony. Her cries fell on deaf ears as a member of the mob approached her writhing in pain. He pulled out a knife, yanked her layered house dress off to expose her abdomen, and with a brutality that is incomprehensible, the man sliced Mary's stomach open with jagged sawing motions, and he removed her infant baby by letting it drop to the ground, where it made 2 small cries. As Mary bled to death hanging upside down from the tree, her first interaction with her baby was watching that same man stomp repeatedly on her infant's head with the heel of his boot, killing it instantly. Within minutes, Mary Turner and her baby were both dead. The mob then cut her down, put the rope around her neck, and hung her lifeless corpse from the same branch of the tree that extended just over the water in front of the bridge. The crowd riddled what was left of the woman with bullets for hours, inflicting hundreds of bullet holes into her body. There, she remained for some time.
Now remember, she's already
The
dead.
only
Then they
thing
shot
marking
her.
her grave when she was finally cut down was an empty whiskey bottle with a congratulatory cigar stuffed into the neck. Despite the barbaric lynching of Hayes Turner and his wife and the child within a span of only 24 hours, the killings did not stop there. Over the course of the next week, 13 more individuals were murdered by the mob. not a single member of the group accused was ever allowed their day in court. Instead, justice was warped to fit within the mold of the systemic racism set forth by themselves, and their lives were snuffed out despite their obvious innocence. The actual shooter died in a shootout with police within a week of the crime. No charges were ever brought to those who committed the lynchings. 100 years have passed since the despicable acts of injustice took place along the banks of Little River. Subsequently, the people of Brooks County, Georgia, have been plagued by the massacre that was instigated all those years ago. With a metal plaque marking the shoreline where Mary and her baby were viciously killed, the stain that this murder left on the community is still visible. In 2013, only 3 years after the plaque was erected, it was found to have 5 bullet holes that penetrated the metal memorial. To this day, it's still unclear who the vandal was. Annually, a crowd will form in honor of Mary, Hayes, and their unnamed infant's memory, ensuring that history does not forget the brutal slayings that the Black community has endured during the Jim Crow era. Although Georgia is certainly not the only state which harbors an endless list of victims lost to the twisted and horrific hands of an angry mob, perhaps there is no other example of our depraved species and the evil we will inflict on one another than that of Mary Turner and her baby.
So for essentially staging a one-woman Black Lives Matter protest, that's how she's treated. Florida was not immune to this level of racial violence. In fact, as it says here in this caption, this infamous photograph of Stacy, well, let me just back up here. This photograph depicts the lynching of a 37-year-old Black man named Reuben Stacy. He's hanging from a tree on Old Davie Road in Fort Lauderdale. Blood trickling down his body, dripping off of his toes. All the while, a 7-year-old white girl looks on, a strange smile on her face, as she takes in the sight of the strange fruit. This is a reference to a Billie Holiday song, an anti-lynching song that jazz great Billie Holiday, the closest thing to a protest record you could get during the jazz age. It is mentioned in chapter 12 of your book, maybe 13. But at any rate, I do discuss strange fruit. Anyway, her elders had just created that hot day in July of 35. And you know, when you think about it, if you did the math, somebody who was 7 years old in 1935 would have been born in 1928. It's possible this person could still be alive. Not likely, but possible. I mean, people are living, you know, into their hundreds now. You know, if she is still alive, then you wonder, well, does she remember this? Unless she has some type of cognitive issue, it would be hard to imagine somebody ever forgetting something like this or seeing something like this. But this infamous photograph of Stacy's death might be one of the few visual accounts of a lynching in Florida. But a new report from the Equal Justice Initiative about lynching across the American South reminds us that the Sunshine State was among the most brutal in the country when it came to race-fueled executions of Black people. The fact that I have highlighted here, per capita, Floridians lynched at a higher rate than any other state. And what the term per capita means, if for all of my statisticians out there, it means for a state, with its population, when compared to other states with similar populations, we led the country. So questions or comments, the need to, process what you've just learned, what you've just seen, before we move on? No, it leaves you speechless, huh? Yeah, I can understand that. And I can understand why some people would not want to be exposed to this and how people would find it upsetting. If I were a K-12 teacher and I were to show something like this, I'd probably land in the principal's office because somebody would, be triggered. And that's part of what the debate is now that's going on with respect to how we teach history. There's some that will say because this accounting and this reckoning makes people uncomfortable, we shouldn't teach it. Well, we know that that's not the way to go either. I mean, not talking about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So we'll see how long they persist. What's up?
I was saying it just means you can't learn from it.
It means you can't learn from it. It means you can plausibly deny that it even happened. And then what will end up happening is these same pupils who were not exposed to this kind of information when they were in middle and high school, then come to college and they run into a teacher like me and they get their worlds rocked. Because don't look now, I believe this quote unquote CRT fight. So this year they focused on K-12. I believe it's coming to the colleges. I do. I believe classes like this one, especially, 2024 is an election year. I can see, in the intervening year and a half we have between that, people really making classes like this one an issue. Why do we have to have a Black history class? That's racist. Not, and understand a lot of people who will say that, especially if they're in the political class, they know better. I think I told you guys, Ron DeSantis was a history major at Yale. So he knows better, right? But he's just going to throw stuff out there that people are going to respond to emotionally for the sake of votes. And that's what makes us all, so cynical and wrong, quite frankly, right? Okay. It's against this backdrop that the philosophies, worldviews, and beliefs and approaches are going to evolve between the two men, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'll say this at the outset, and I'll maybe circle back to this point once we have been presented in full with the entirety of what both men embrace. Again, I want to point out that more detailed information is contained in your text, and it will be your responsibility to read that information in chapter 12. But in sum, Booker T. Washington's philosophy was, can pretty much be encapsulated in these bullet points that you see here projected. He believed that given the contemporaneous climate that African Americans were operating under during this time period that we're speaking of, that it would be in our best interest to give up fighting for social equality. We should instead secure economic independence through entrepreneurialism, property ownership. We should also seek to gain a monopoly on trade careers. Now, I want to hit the pause button here real quickly, maybe put an asterisk next to that term trade careers. Keep in mind, we're talking about the early 20th century. So what would have qualified as a trade career then is likely different from what would qualify as a trade career now. And I'm assuming we know roughly what we mean by the term trade career, right? These are things that a vocational type of education where you wouldn't necessarily obtain the kind of credential that you would obtain going through, a baccalaureate program or an associate of arts program, one that prepares you for baccalaureate level study. You'd go instead to like Lively, right next door, or you'd obtain one of our AS degrees here at TCC that we offer, a degree that wouldn't transfer to a four-year school. Or you'd go through like our truck driving school or something like that. What might be some examples of trade careers that you might can think of in the early 20th century? Construction? Yes, that's always a big one, except they probably would have referred to it as carpentry, but it's the same general thing. Yes, so tailoring, seamstressing, okay. Other examples might include things like bricklaying, also known as masonry. You might have started seeing the coming on board of things like electrician and plumbing as those technologies are starting to emerge in the early 19th century. So far as Black people were concerned, though, you're talking about a focus on, carpentry, masonry, with women, maybe practical nursing, not the kind of nursing that involves, more advanced levels of study, but like I said, the practical dimensions of nursing. Midwifery or midwifery, I think that's how you pronounce that. Which was how a lot of babies, both Black and white, were delivered once upon a time in this country. You didn't go through, an OBGYN. And there's a body of literature that talks about how, clinicalizing childbirth had the effect of pushing Black women out of a special niche that had been created for Black women that could afford them professional levels of wage earning potential. But the medical establishment sort of, put the clamps on that. If anybody was interested in doing historical research and combining it maybe with an interest in medicine, that might be a field you can look at, or a topic you can look at. How the medical establishment ran Black women out of midwifery, and all of a sudden pregnancy becomes an illness that you have to go to see a doctor for, right? But I digress. Booker T. Washington was also a proponent of African Americans creating their own institutions, businesses, and neighborhoods. In other words, he's embracing this idea of racial separation. Not necessarily pushing so hard through activism to integrate with the mainstream. Let's just create our own institutions. The sum of his philosophy is going to be, of course, attacked and derided by his critics. This apparent acceptance of segregation as it was being implemented during the time period in question. His critics are going to say, well, he's basically saying we should just lay down and accept this. They're going to call it, and you can put this in your notes, Washington's critics are going to refer to this approach to dealing with the realities of emerging Jim Crow segregation and all the other things that go along with it as accommodation. You're accommodating the segregationists. And the first sort of full-throated public articulation of these ideals and principles is going to come from Washington himself The year after the Supreme Court renders its decision in 1895, the following year in 1896, Washington is going to deliver a speech to a congregation of farmers who had come together in Atlanta, Georgia for something called the Cotton States Expo. This was a multi-day event where if you were a big time player in cotton production, you would descend on a given area. In this particular year's case, it was Atlanta. And you would, listen to workshops or speeches given by experts on, different tactics and techniques you would want to perhaps incorporate into your cotton growing business. And also there'd be a room to discuss politics. Well, Booker T. Washington was invited to speak at this event. And so he tells, so I'm not even going to tell you this. I don't want to be a spoiler alert because I want you to critically think about this. So it's 1896. The Supreme Court has just rendered the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. You're at a multi-day convention in Atlanta. So that means that there are people that have traveled there from all over the South. It takes what to travel? Okay, so we're talking about fairly affluent people here because, the reason it takes money is because you have to feed yourself, you have to put yourself up. So, most people don't have that level of discretionary income to go to something like this. So you're talking about, let's consider the audience here, white, affluent men, and this is who Booker T. Washington is speaking to. I ask you, what speech could he have given? What could he possibly have said, given who his audience was? Probably couldn't say anything other than what he did say, in which all of these principles are more or less articulated in one shape, way, or form that his critics are now giving him the business about, okay? The name of that speech, it's more formally referred to as the Atlanta Exposition, but it is also nicknamed the Cast Down Your Bucket speech. And the reason why it is given that nickname is because of a oft repeated refrain that Booker T. Washington uses throughout the speech. It's actually a rhetorical device when you repeat the same phrase over and over again for emphasis. And that phrase in Booker T. Washington's case is cast down your bucket. Now, I'm going to attempt to play or to pull up the link. As a matter of fact, now that I think about it, I'm up here talking. Y'all got to know, I go like semester to semester between my presentation of these lessons. Once upon a time, I actually had a link that took us to an audio recording where you could actually hear Booker T. Washington's voice. Because audio recording technology was in its infancy. The quality of the recording wasn't that great, but you could still hear Booker T. Washington's voice as he was delivering that speech. I think that has since been taken down. I actually had to find another link that took you, oh, no, I found it. Okay, yay, they didn't take it down. Because sometimes when you click on things that are linked out, sometimes they'll say, oh, it's a broken link, it's gone. But this one's still there, that's good. All right, so you're gonna actually hear Booker T. Washington's voice. I'm really excited about that. You guys just don't even know. Okay. Can y'all see this? Let me see if I can blow it up a little bit. Because I said the quality of the sound's not that great, but this is what you're going to hear him say. So I've got the text transcript here. Do I need to make it a little bigger or is this okay? Okay, how about now? Okay. All right, and I'll just try to do my best to cursor where he is, okay?
Mr. President and gentlemen of the Board of Directors and citizens, 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise seeking the material, civil, or moral welfare of this section can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success. I will convey to you, Mr. President and Directors, the sentiment of the masses of my race when I say that in no way have the value and manhood of the American Negro been more fittingly and generously recognized than by the managers of this magnificent expedition at every stage of its progress. It is a recognition that will do more to cement the friendship of the two races than any occurrence since the dawn of our freedom. Now, not only this, but the opportunity here afforded will awaken among us a new era of industrial progress. Ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life, we began at the top instead of the bottom. That a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill. That the political convention or some species had more attraction than starting a dairy farm or a truck garden. A ship lost at sea for many days suddenly sighted a friendly vessel. From the mast of the unfortunate vessel was seen a signal: water, water, we die of thirst. The answer from the friendly vessel at once came back: cast down your bucket where you are. A second time, the signal, water, send us water, ran up from the distressed vessel and was answered: cast down your bucket where you are. A third and fourth signal for water was answered: cast down your bucket where you are. The captain of the distressed vessel at last, heeding the injunction, cast down his bucket, and it came up full of fresh, sparkling water from the mouth of the Amazon River. Those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate the importance of cultivating friend relations with the southern white man, who is their next door neighbor, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down, making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom you are surrounded. To those of the white race who look to the incoming of those of foreign birth, strange tongue and habits for the prosperity of the South, were I permitted, I would repeat what I have said to my own race: cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down among the 8 millions of Negroes whose habits you know, whose fidelity and love you have tested in days when you have proved treacherous, meant the ruin of your fireside. Cast down your bucket among these people who have, without strife and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forests, building your railroads and cities, brought forth treasures from the bowels of the earth, helped to make possible this magnificent representation of the progress of the South.
All right, so let's digest the contents of this speech and perform what I sometimes refer to as a primary source analysis. Y'all know what a primary source is? It's another one of those historical terms. What do y'all think it means?
The original, you're not recounting or retelling something to someone else, telling about something, it is just presenting straight from.
And that's why y'all are in honors class, because y'all know things. I love it, okay? So this is a primary source. We're getting it directly from Booker T. Washington's mouth, quite literally, because you actually have, and this is the cool thing of kind of getting into the eras in which we're getting into. Now that we're kind of moving into the 20th century, we're now going to have moving pictures and sound and video. So it's going to get a little bit more animated, the way that we'll get to, talk about these historical events. We're going to perform a primary source analysis here. Let's look at his words. So we already kind of thought about, who was the audience? Affluent white men from the South. And again, what could Booker T. Washington, what else could he have possibly said? given the circumstances, given who his audience was. Like, what was he gonna get up there and say? Defund the police? I mean, y'all know I'm being kind of facetious there, but y'all get the point. Black Lives Matter. I mean, this is 1895. I think I misspoke earlier. He actually gave this speech the same year of Plessy versus Ferguson, not the year after. So I stand corrected there, but what did he mean by casting the bucket down? Like, he told this anecdote. You know, what was the anecdote? Like, how does this anecdote of the bucket being cast down in the Amazon, how does that relate to how he believes whites and blacks should interact with each other, especially in the South? What's the relationship there? Did this anecdote make any sense relative to what he was talking about? Yes. Okay.
As you say, essentially rely on those and kind of rally your community together, or at least that was the message he was giving to the black population that he was giving, and then to the white population. I think he was like kind of being the organization rely more on like the people, just like kind of support the black people that well, but you can't say that because
Right, it would have been controversial, and you know, we've already kind of deduced what happens to people who don't toe the line in this era of de facto segregation. But let's look at this line in particular, unless Katrina, were you like itching to, okay. So let's look at this line. It says here, to those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land. Booker T. Washington is actually making a specific reference to groups of African Americans who believe that becoming an expatriate or expat, a member of an expat community in, say, Africa, was the way that Black people should go. Like, there's no way we're ever gonna really achieve equity and parity in this country, so let's not even try. Let's take it back to the motherland. And so there is this nascent back to Africa movement. It doesn't get a whole lot of attention because in the grand scheme of things, it's not that widespread, although there are a few who take their cues from some of the proponents of this strategy. So when he says, if you think you're going to better your condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate, he goes on, the importance of preserving friendly relations with the Southern white man, who is their next door neighbor, cast down your bucket where you are, in much the same way that he's saying the ship who is in distress on the Amazon River is saying they need water, even though they're surrounded by water, being that they're in the middle of the Amazon River. And he's saying, you know, cast down your bucket and you can get some water, okay? So he's essentially relating or making the analogy that we have all that is within our arsenal if we simply cast down our buckets where we are. He says, make friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom you are surrounded. And he then goes on to clarify what he means by that, or I won't say he goes on to clarify, but in my opinion, he clarifies it a little further up in the speech. He says here, ignorant and inexperienced. Is it not strange that in the first years of our new life, we began at the top instead of the bottom, that a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill? So he's, in my view, taking aim at the political gains Black people made the agenda to make political advancements that we saw in Reconstruction, and how, in his view, people were more anxious to acquire that than they were real estate or an industrial skill that the political convention of some teaching had more attraction than starting a dairy farm or a stockyard. And the reasoning behind that logic, you know, he's saying, basically, you just came out of slavery where you have been equipped with the wherewithal to run a farm. You know how to raise crops like the back of your hand. Start from there, build upon that knowledge base and go from there. And when he then later goes on to say, making friends in every manly way possible, his indication there is essentially saying, if Black people become indispensable parts of the economy, that respect from white people will have no choice but to follow from that. Okay. He goes on to say to white people, that same message, casting your bucket down, instead of looking to immigrants. Remember on the very first slide, we said this was an era in which European immigration was particularly pervasive. European immigrants were coming in from Italy, Sicily, Greece, all other parts of Europe. When they came to this country, they weren't necessarily coming to the South anyway. They were mainly relocating to like the Northeast and the industrial Midwest. Very few made their way here. And he's basically saying to Southern whites, don't even, you know, raise the banner to bring them here. When you've got, I believe he used the number 8 million, you've got 8 million people that you can employ in your agricultural or industrial enterprises as unskilled labor. And you know us, you don't know these foreigners. You know us. So why would you, you know, bring in all these foreign people? You don't know their habits, you don't know their customs. They may strike on you. Because again, a part of what is happening during this time period, the Gilded Age, yes, there's all this economic progress and growth, but there's a great deal of labor unrest that is occurring at the exact same time. So we see the burgeoning labor movement taking place in this country. And yes, work stoppages, strikes, a lot of times violence came out of those events. So he's like, why would you even invite that here? You know, you've got a loyal population that's willing to work for you. Now, that's basically where the substance of Washington's beliefs and philosophies come from. Du Bois, who some might consider is on the opposite side of the spectrum, is going to say, instead of us accommodating segregation and just accepting it, in fact, Washington doesn't say it in this speech. I need to just mention this very quickly, and then we'll move on to the Du Bois topic. Washington didn't say this in this particular speech, but he does say in another instance, again, addressing primarily, you know, a white audience, that when it came to all things social, the two races could be just as separate as the 5 fingers on one's hand. He did say that. So people like Du Bois and others who thought like him are going to, quite frankly, be offended by that. You know, Du Bois believes that there should be a fight for social and political equality, that Black people should mount it, that we are within our rights to demand it, that we should have our civil rights protected, and that that protection should come both through the courts and by who we elect, so that we therefore then need to be active participants in the political process. And there's no way that we can have equal access to housing, to jobs, to education, all manner of opportunity unless we integrate. There's no way that we can have access to equality if we're not equal participants in the mainstream of American society. So he is going to be a proponent of integration. Yes. W.E.B. Du Bois, and W stands for William, and the E.B. Stands for two names of which it's very difficult for me to pronounce. The E stands for Earnhardt. I'm not exactly sure, I'm going to just be honest with you, how to pronounce his third name that starts with a B, because it's I believe German. So there's that. But we refer to him as W.E.B. We've always referred to him, at least in how I've always referred to him in my studies, by his initials. Now, I think it's instructive here that we speak a little bit about the background of these two gentlemen, because not only does the substance of their philosophies matter and how they differ, but the substance of their philosophies is informed a great deal by their backgrounds. I mean, that makes sense. Basically, your background is going to inform your worldview. I mean, we can say that of any of us. And so with Washington and Du Bois, there's no exception. You see, Washington, to kind of go back to his slide, was born in 1856. So he's born right before the outbreak of the Civil War. He's 9 years old when the Civil War ends and freedom comes. He never is able to quite determine definitively who his father was, but we do know that he was white, either the owner or the owner's son. Of course, his maternity was never in question. He knew who his mother was, but never really knew who his father was. So he was of mixed race heritage. At the age of 16, and let me just back up here, he spent a significant amount of his childhood in the household of a white couple whose matriarch was originally from New England. The reason why that's significant is because she kind of brought into Washington's life the whole Puritan philosophy of working hard as a way of establishing your success. So you probably have heard mention, for example, of the Puritan work ethic. So he gets this from this white matriarch that was very, very much instrumental in his upbringing. At 16 years old, he makes an appeal to an official at Hampton University, goes there to try to secure for himself to further his education, but couldn't afford it. And he offers to perform janitorial work in exchange for the right to take classes there, to obtain room and board. And the education that he receives at what was then known as Hampton Institute in Virginia is going to be the model upon which he will eventually establish a school of his own, this one in Alabama, that would go by the name of Tuskegee Institute, named for the town in Alabama where it was established. See, so all of that, you know, the humble beginnings, the fact that he was born into slavery in the South, he's going to recount his life's story in an autobiography that gets published in 1895 called Up From Slavery. So a lot of these ideals that he promotes that I've so far introduced you to this morning are interwoven throughout the narrative of his life story in that book. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, grew up very differently. He was born in 1855 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He'd never known slavery. In fact, had actually had the benefit of a formal education in integrated settings. The same year that Booker T. Washington gives that speech at the Atlanta Cotton States Exposition, the Atlanta Address, the same year that he publishes Up from Slavery, is the same year that W.E.B. Du Bois becomes the first Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard. And for those who are unfamiliar with the process of obtaining the PhD, it's a terminal degree. It's an indication that you're supposed to be an expert in your field, not that you know it all, but you should be, well versed enough to have a good grasp of knowledge on the field in which that degree is bestowed in. So in my case, it's history. But one of the things you have to do is you have to write a book-length research paper of original research. You either have to perform original research or you have to provide original insight on an already existing topic. And then you have to subject it to rigorous review by a committee, a panel. It's called your dissertation committee. And I'm telling y'all this because I'm talking to honor students. So I think I'm talking to some PhDs in here. So you'll know like what to expect. If I can give you some advice, I know this is kind of jumping the gun maybe a little bit, but nobody told me this when I was getting my doctorate. You should make every major paper in graduate school a chapter in your dissertation. Now, you probably aren't going to remember that 10 years from now, but you should. But what do you think you're going to get your PhD in? I'm curious. Yeah, psychology. So in addition to writing the book-length paper, you also have to, of course, take classes. And in just about every class, if not in every class, well, it depends on the discipline. In my case, there were some classes where I didn't have to do a capstone semester ending research paper that was 25 to 30 pages long. In some classes, they just had you read a book a week and you would have to write, summaries or précises on said book. So again, it depends on the professor, the class, the discipline, and all of that. But in these classes where you do have those long papers that you have to turn in at the end of the semester, that's what you do. So just sort of settle in on a topic early for what you want to do your research on, and then just find a way in every class to work it in. That'll make your process so, I don't even know if your major professor would tell you that. Mine didn't. So I just, and when I learned that, I was already done. Like, well, darn, if I'd have done that. Exactly. And oh, well, my major professor hated, I submitted 2 ideas that were totally unrelated. One was like a Russian Soviet inspired topic, and one was, a more of an intellectual history inspired topic. He didn't like either idea. So I ended up switching like major professors. It was, we need to have a conversation. It was a thing. But Du Bois withstood the rigors of a PhD program at a time when Black people weren't getting PhDs. So his predisposition towards academic pursuits already had him favorably disposed or pre-biased, I guess you could say, prejudiced towards an academic pursuit, because that's the route he took, right? And the idea about integration to bring about equality, again, that's a reflection of his experience. One final thing I'll say about Du Bois, because I know time is up for our class today, but do you all remember the story of Mumbet Freeman? the first Black woman to file a lawsuit in America and actually win when she sued for her freedom, Elizabeth Freeman. This was Du Bois's maternal grandma. So that strain of activism, which will later propel him to become one of the co-founders and early leaders of the NAACP, the most significant civil rights organization of the 20th century, that's in his DNA. So when we come back on Monday, and hopefully to a much fuller class, we're going to analyze some of Du Bois's quotes, and we're gonna try to answer the question of who was right. Or is it even fair to put them on opposite poles like that? Again, I'm gonna ask us to maybe reconsider the way that traditionally the philosophies of these two men have been presented, including even up to how I presented it today. That's where we'll stop. We had a good class today, I think. And I will make sure to make this recording available to our compatriots that were not here, and basically to all of you, so that you can have it as a reference. Yes, sir.
The total aside on the total past all the actual.
Okay.
Do you happen to know what his dissertation was on? Because given the time.
Yes.
That would be.
The transatlantic slave trade. Yes, yes. And in fact, he's going to be a foremost educator and scholar on the Black experience. When you talk about historiography, the history that he writes on Reconstruction is going to be the first major challenge to what was known as the Dunning School of Reconstruction. And this was the narrative about Reconstruction that said it was a tragic mistake and we should have let, and I'm oversimplifying it, but basically we shouldn't have let all these Black people, into the political process because they basically ruined it, and the white folks had to come in and save everything. And so the Ku Klux Klan was actually providing us a service by getting rid of all the Black people and the Yankees who had invaded the South and taken all the politics over. So in 1935, Du Bois writes, and I've got the book, it's literally 1,000 pages. I still haven't read the whole thing, okay? But I've read, significant excerpts from it, but it's the first major challenge to that perspective on Reconstruction. And this will not be, the only time that he does this. Yes, ma'am.
I'm kind of back to the recording and like that scared me.
Oh. Oh, you mean this? Oh. Well, let's stop the recording on that note.